This is the leading news from the Albuquerque Journal. I'm Gino Gutierrez. It's Thursday, July 16th. Here's what we're covering on today's episode. New Mexico's push to obtain unredacted records related to Jeffrey Epstein took center stage on Capitol Hill on Wednesday. With more on this, I'm now joined by the Journal's Capitol Bureau Chief, Dan Boyd. Dan, thanks for joining me.
You bet. Thanks for having me.
So Dan, I'm sure listeners are wondering, as well as I am, why New Mexico was a topic of conversation yesterday at Capitol Hill. What can you tell us about why that was?
Yeah, so obviously we've been following now for a number of months the state's investigation into late Jeffrey Epstein and his ranch, the Zorro Ranch in New Mexico, that had operated, back more than 10 years ago, but had no charges were ever filed criminally in New Mexico. And this has kind of become the focus again of a state investigation that was reopened by Attorney General Raul Torres in February. So during today's hearing, it was for President Trump's pick for Director of National Intelligence, Jay Clayton. And during the hearing, Senator Martin Heinrich, obviously from New Mexico, who's a member of this committee, asked him directly about the Attorney General's request for unredacted records related to Jeffrey Epstein and activities that took place in New Mexico. And the Attorney General has been pushing for these files for the last few months, and he's been growing frustrated. He said he hasn't been given kind of these unredacted files. So it was striking to see Senator Heinrich bring up this issue to Jay Clayton, who's potentially going to have a very influential role over these internal files. And in response, Jay Clayton said, that he'd be willing to work with the Attorney General, but he did bring up that some of these records might be, covered by court orders, kind of making them confidential, so that there was some complications there. But interesting to see this state investigation kind of take center stage in a hearing in the U.S. Senate today.
And Dan, as you mentioned, Clayton did signal that there could be some cooperation, but as you mentioned, some limits on what that would be. And really, this entire Jeffrey Epstein saga here in New Mexico has been something you and our colleagues have been following along, and it goes back a couple years. There was a previous state investigation that ended after federal officials asked New Mexico to pause its inquiry in 2019. Then in March, obviously, the state reopening that state investigation, along with a truth-finding commission also being done at the same time with New Mexico lawmakers. So a lot going on in New Mexico right now in terms of Jeffrey Epstein and his property Zorro Ranch.
Yeah, it's been an interesting saga to follow, and as you mentioned, it's played out over years, but I think largely due to kind of public interest in the Epstein files, and largely due as well to victims' testimony and victims kind of refusing to let this whole saga go away quietly. That it's kind of come back to public interest, and as I mentioned, being the criminal investigation being reopened by Raul Torres, as well as the truth-finding commission that you mentioned being approved by the legislature. So still not kind of clear what all is going to come out of these investigations, but clearly I think the state has grown frustrated by the lack of cooperation from the federal government and the fact that they haven't been able to access all the records they want. And at the same time, the clock is ticking. Some witnesses may be more reluctant to come forward. Some folks, may no longer be alive and, who are involved in the case. So it does make it more difficult, I think, the longer time passes without some of these questions being resolved.
And Dan, I want to talk about a particular date that you mentioned in your story, and that is July 31st. And that was a date you got from the New Mexico Department of Justice. What exactly is so important about that date?
Yeah, I spoke with the Attorney General's Chief of Staff today, and she referenced that deadline in a statement that she provided. It's unclear whether the state does have kind of the legal authority to compel the federal government to turn over these records, but I think it's clear they're going to, if this deadline isn't met, that they're at least going to try, going to Plan B and seeing if they can, either whether that's through a subpoena or some kind of federal legislation, compel these records to be divulged. At the same time, I think there is, a sensitivity to make sure that these records are made available to investigators, but not publicly made available if they shouldn't be. Senator Heinrich today also brought up that the U.S. Department of Justice did release some victim information earlier this year, unredacted, that apparently was not supposed to be released. So I think it's kind of a balancing act to make sure the state investigators are able to review this information without anything, that's not supposed to be made public being made public.
And Dan, on the off chance that we have any listeners that may not be too familiar with Jeffrey Epstein Epstein's history here in New Mexico. Throughout our conversation, we've referenced a lot of keywords like Zorro Ranch, which is a property that Epstein owned that was outside of Santa Fe. Can you give us a little bit of background on Epstein's presence here in New Mexico and why there's this strong renewed push by local lawmakers to really investigate what he did here?
Yeah, a lot of people who've really closely followed this whole episode have said that Jeffrey Epstein's property in New Mexico, Zorro Ranch, kind of flew under the radar more so than his other properties in New York or the Virgin Islands, Florida. There's been allegations of very serious crimes, human trafficking, sexual assault happening at Zorro Ranch. And as we talked about earlier, the state had been investigating those issues and how maybe some of these things happened with maybe gaps in the state system. But they agreed in 2019 to hand over the evidence to the federal government, and former Attorney General Hector Balderas said then that federal prosecutors after that kind of never followed up their end of the deal, and no charges were ultimately filed. So I think the thinking is, justice is still better served late than never, and there's a lot of people who feel like Jeffrey Epstein's activities in New Mexico and maybe some of his collaborators, haven't been kind of held accountable for their actions.
So really interesting developments here, Dan, as the discussion about Jeffrey Epstein's activities here in New Mexico taking center stage during that Senate hearing on Wednesday. And as you mentioned, still a little unclear as the Attorney General's office set that end of the month deadline, what legal avenues remain for them to kind of compel the federal government to share these materials. But this nominee saying there could be some cooperation, but only time will tell really where this goes from here.
Yeah, I think that's right. It'll be interesting to see where this leads. I have a feeling we'll be writing much more about this, but noteworthy to have this top federal official who could be on the cusp of being confirmed as the Director of National Intelligence saying he's willing to work with New Mexico officials. We'll see over the next few weeks whether that happens or not.
Should be interesting to follow. Thank you as always, Dan.
You bet. Appreciate it.
The University of New Mexico Hospital will end its role as the healthcare provider at Bernalillo County's Metropolitan Detention Center when its contract expires in July of next year. County officials and UNMH say the decision was mutual, and both organizations will spend the next year working to ensure a smooth transition while developing a new healthcare model for the jail. UNMH took over inmate medical, dental, and behavioral health services in 2023 after two private providers left amid concerns over poor care and rising inmate deaths. Since 2020, 49 people have died at the jail or after becoming ill there, including 24 since UNMH assumed responsibility. Federal monitors have also found the hospital failed to consistently meet constitutional healthcare standards required under a long-standing settlement agreement. The county recently approved millions of dollars in additional funding to cover rising healthcare costs, largely driven by the use of travel nurses. Officials say local and national experts will now help identify a new provider and help develop recommendations to improve the quality and sustainability of healthcare services at the detention center before the current contract ends. New Mexico once again had the nation's highest pedestrian fatality rate in 2025, according to a new Governor's Highway Safety Association report. The state recorded 91 pedestrian deaths last year, down from 102 in 2024, but still enough to rank first nationally, with 4.27 deaths per 100,000 residents. Nearly half of those fatalities occurred in the Albuquerque metro area. State transportation officials say the slight decline is encouraging, but stress that every pedestrian death is preventable. New Mexico continues to invest in its Target Zero Safety Initiative and other efforts aimed at eliminating traffic deaths by 2050. Albuquerque has also expanded pedestrian safety projects along one of the city's deadliest corridors, Central Avenue between San Mateo and Eubank. Improvements include new hawk crossings, dedicated transit lanes, better lighting, and median fencing to reduce dangerous crossings. The national report praised those infrastructure changes and noted future statewide initiatives, including new driver's education requirements focused on pedestrian safety, beginning in 2027. So far this year, Albuquerque has recorded 10 pedestrian and 2 cyclist fatalities, with 4 of those deaths occurring along Central Avenue. State and local officials hope continued infrastructure upgrades and education efforts will help reverse New Mexico's long-standing pedestrian safety problem. The Roswell Daily Record will remain in publication after all. Just days after announcing it would close following more than 120 years in business, the newspaper has been sold to the New Mexico News Group and Control Plus P Publishing with support from the nonprofit Citizen Media Group. Publisher and co-owner Barbara Beck says keeping the paper alive was her top priority, calling community newspapers, quote, vitally important, and warning that many people don't realize what's lost when a local newspaper disappears. The Daily Record has been owned by the Beck family since 1933. New Mexico News Group founder Pat Davis says his company will officially take over on August 1st. While the paper has financial challenges, Davis said the immediate goal was prevented from shutting down permanently. The newspaper will continue publishing once a week on Thursdays, and subscribers will also receive access to the company's other New Mexico publications. Founded in 1891, the Roswell Record is one of New Mexico's oldest newspapers and is perhaps best known for breaking the story of the alleged 1947 UFO crash near Roswell. And in sports news, a New Mexico Court of Appeals ruling has revived the possibility of building a New Mexico United soccer stadium at Balloon Fiesta Park. The court upheld a lower court's decision rejecting a lawsuit filed by 3 neighborhood associations that challenged the city's approval process, citing concerns about traffic, noise, and light pollution. The ruling marks another legal victory for the city and the club, though the neighborhood groups can still appeal to the New Mexico Supreme Court. The United have been searching for a permanent home since joining the USL Championship in 2019. The privately funded $30 million Balloon Fiesta Park proposal was selected in 2023 after a publicly funded downtown stadium plan failed. The state has also committed nearly $14 million for infrastructure improvements at the park. Construction has been on hold throughout the legal battle, leading the club to explore relocating the project to the redeveloped New Mexico State Fair grounds. Tuesday's decision could put Balloon Fiesta Park back into serious consideration, depending on whether the neighborhood groups pursue another appeal. The leading news is powered by the journalism of the Albuquerque Journal. If you enjoy hearing all of the stories we share with you here daily, please consider becoming a digital subscriber to the Journal by utilizing the discount code in our show notes. Every subscription helps support local journalism and allows us to provide you with the news that matters to you. Now taking a look at Albuquerque's weather forecast. Scattered showers and thunderstorms are expected today, mainly after 3 p.m., mostly sunny with a high near 91. As for this evening, scattered showers and thunderstorms are expected again, mainly between 9 p.m. and midnight. Mostly cloudy with a low around 65. To keep up with all the latest news from the Albuquerque Journal, you can visit our website at abqjournal.com. That's the leading news. I'm Gino Gutierrez. We'll be back tomorrow.